In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most important skills in chess, which is positional evaluation. We will be talking about how to evaluate positions correctly, what are the criteria that matter when evaluating a position, such as king safety, piece activity, and so on, and why this skill matters more than you think. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. First things first, let's start this video off by discussing why evaluation is one of the most important skills in chess. So in chess, you need to be able to evaluate positions correctly because you need to figure out which line is best for you. When you calculate a specific line, let's say bishop takes f6, you have multiple options here. You can recapture with the knight, you can recapture with the bishop, but you need to have the ability to determine which capture is better and disregard the moves that are bad. And for this, you need positional evaluation. So for example, in a position like this, both of these captures are good. Let's say knight takes. What happens if white lazily takes this pawn? Are not we losing a pawn here? This is a free pawn, right? Not exactly, because this, first of all, this bishop is defended, and secondly, we can start by creating threats here. We can go rook a to c8, just simply continuing to activate our pieces. And that is another factor that you have to consider. Piece activity matters more than material when it comes to evaluating a chess position. In this position, white is up a pawn. White just captured a pawn on e5. However, black has a very nice bishop on b7, pressuring this pawn. The knight is also quite good, pressuring this. This bishop is not so good, but there are always ideas of bishop to d6 to pressure this, or maybe if the knight is gone, bishop to c5 in order to give a check to the king. That is a very dangerous idea that white always has to watch out for. But white's pieces are not so great. If you look at this position, the bishop is behind its own pawn. It is only defending the pawn. It's not really pressuring anything, so its activity is very limited. This rook is not doing anything because there's nothing on this file. f5 pawn blocks everything. This rook is also not doing anything right away. For this rook to activate, you would have to chip away at this structure either with a4 or c4. Neither of those moves are possible right now. So this rook is also very passive. The knights are not so great because this knight once again is only defending. This knight's not even doing anything because it cannot jump to either c5 or a5. So it turns out all of white's pieces are very, very suboptimal. Even though white is up a pawn here, the evaluation here favors black a lot, and this is a much better position for the black pieces. And you need to be able to determine these sorts of things from far away. And if you're able to do that, you're going to get better positions and you're going to be able to outplay your opponents. So in a position like this, what would white do? Well, white would have to further activate his pieces. Let's say a move like rook to e1 is played, but once again, that doesn't do anything. It creates a threat. It's a one-move threat on the bishop on e7, and it's not really that helpful. Just a very simple bishop to d6, counter-attacking the queen, deals with this threat very well. Queen moves to d4. We go rook to c4, pressuring the queen, pressuring the knight. Let's say queen d3, because the queen has to maintain some form of vision on the knight, because if the queen moves away, let's say to f2, you would lose the knight. This is very, very bad for the white pieces. You don't want to drop a horse, but now this knight gets pinned and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. It is very, very difficult to defend. Even rook e3 doesn't defend, you just capture because the queen is the main defender. You would have to give up the queen. This is of course going to be winning for the black pieces. Black is up a whole queen for a rook, and that's not good for the white pieces. So you need to be able to evaluate these positions from far away in order to become a strong calculator and a strong chess player. Calculation itself is never going to be enough when trying to win a chess game. You need to have the skill to evaluate what you calculate. You have to have the ability to evaluate the positions that you calculate so you are able to pick the best one and you're able to actually outplay and outmaneuver your opponents, even out-tactic your opponents. You need the skill of evaluation. Let's take a look at this position right now. So in this position, both kings are feeling a little bit unsafe. At first glance, when you look at this, you might think that the black king is actually maybe a little bit safer than the white king, because when you look at this position, you see there's a rook on a2, queen on c2. Oh, there's pressure over here. What do? You see that maybe queen e2, queen to g4 is coming, and this is extremely dangerous for the white pieces. But in reality, the black king is the one that is in danger here. Now, when it comes to evaluating a position, king's safety is the most important factor. That makes sense because the goal of the game is to checkmate the opponent's king. So it makes sense that king's safety would be your number one priority. However, a lot of people get this wrong because they have arbitrary lines. Let's say, for example, if the king was in the center in the beginning of the game, oh, the king is in the center, so it must be unsafe. That's not quite right. Every position is different, and you have to analyze every position objectively. In this case, white king is in no danger at all. White king is actually completely safe, and the black king is the one in danger if white is able to find the correct move here. And there is only one winning move in this position, and that winning move, ladies and gentlemen, is king to h4. Now, even computer is struggling to see this idea. The evaluation just went down a little bit. Oh, now it went back up. But for a moment, computer was saying this is only like +1, but now it's +7 because this position is completely winning. The reason why it's winning is because this king is very, very safe. And if anything, this king can even go up to g5 and h6. We're trying to move this king to h6 in order to checkmate the black king. If black tries to checkmate us with a move like queen e2, trying to play queen g4, this is a checkmate threat. However, there's a very big difference between a checkmate threat and an actual checkmate, because we can run to g5, and if the queen goes to g4 with a check, we can run to h6. The king is completely safe on h6, and this king, on the other hand, is getting checkmated. The only way to delay checkmate here is to sacrifice the queen either on g5 or f4. Of course, this doesn't do anything. We would simply capture back. Queen g7 is going to be checkmate on the next move. If the black king decides that it doesn't want to get checkmated and it does not want to allow white king to access h6, instead plays king to h7, now that weakens f7, so rook takes f7 will lead to checkmate nonetheless. King h6 will still come, and queen h7 or queen g7 or even queen f8 will be checkmate. So be very careful when you are evaluating which king is safe and which king is not safe, because every situation is different, and sometimes a king might look unsafe, but in fact it is perfectly safe, and the opposite might apply as well. In this case, black's king looks safe, but it is not. We have to be objective. We have to look at every resource that is available, and we have to be very practical. Can black get to the white king? From a practical point of view, you can try queen e2, queen g4. However, as we discussed, we have king h4 and then bringing our king to h6, and we can actually get to the black's king while black cannot get to our king. So this is a completely winning position for the white pieces. The second most important criteria for evaluating a position right after king safety is the activity of your pieces. And in this position, as you can tell, white has a significantly better position because white has significantly better pieces. If we compare these pieces to the black counterparts, we're going to realize that this rook is much better than the rook on a8. This rook on e1 is much better than the rook on f8. This rook cannot be developed to either e8 or c8. It can only go to d8, where it's only serving a defensive role, and this knight is also struggling to develop, and it is especially going to struggle even more because it is white to play, and what white will do here is simply infiltrate on the 7th rank. And after a move like rook to c7, this knight cannot move whatsoever. It cannot be developed at all. And this is because white's pieces are significantly more active, they're controlling more squares, and because black did not really oppose white earlier in the game, this is what happened. So in a position like this, it's very hard to play with the black pieces. What I'm guessing that you have to do in this position is that you have to play a5, because you have to get this knight out one way or another. Let's say in this position you go rook to e7, knight to a6, you would move the rook to either b7 or a7 here. Let's say rook to a7 is played, and you would get into this position right here, which is of course significantly more active than the black's position. As a matter of fact, there is a tactic here, rook takes f7, and if rook takes f7, there's rook takes a8 with a completely winning position, because we would capture the knight, and if this rook is taken, okay, we can just simply capture back, and once again this is a completely winning position. The knight has to go back to b8 and become passive once again, while our knight jumps in the center, and now this unfortunate knight went to a6 and then went back to b8, and it is completely passive on this square. So whenever you have a situation like this where your pieces are significantly better than your opponent's counterparts, you're always going to have a more active position, more active placement for your pieces, and you're always going to be much better. Or it depends on how active you are. You might only be slightly better, but you will have some form of advantage. Of course, when we are evaluating a position, we always have to take material into consideration. And in this position, everything is equal except that the black pieces do not have a pawn on a6 or a7. So white is effectively up a pawn in this position. And even though the rooks are about similar here, the knights are also about similar. I would even say maybe black's knight is slightly better than the white's knight, but it doesn't really matter here because white is up a pawn and white is up a clean pawn at that. So whenever you have a situation like this where white is up in material, you have to have a significantly more active position as the black pieces in order to make up for that pawn. But in this case, that's not the case. The activity is quite similar. The safety of the kings is also quite similar. And this is a winning position for the white pieces. White will simply go king f1 and start trading on the e-file. And what are you going to do with the black pieces? There is not a lot of things you can do. You will trade on e8, rook to e1. Let's say knight to e4 is played. But it's not going to help because white can always move this knight away and play f3 at an appropriate moment. Firstly, it's better to start with rook e2 to stop all the checks on d2, potential checks that can happen. And after a move like g5, you would move the knight away, then you would play f3, and this would be a winning position for the white pieces. Knight will go back to d6. This exchange will happen once again, and this is just a winning endgame because you're up a clean pawn. You will go b4, a4, and soon you will create a passed pawn, and you will win this game with the white pieces. Okay, now let's talk about pawn structures. So in a position like this, white only has 2 pawn islands and black has 3 pawn islands. This means that black's pawns are quite split and they're easier to target for the white pieces. Therefore, this is slightly advantageous for white. So in a position like this, we can easily target these pawns and maybe even the pawn on a7 in the future. While black, yes, black can also target a2, but it is going to be a bit more difficult because we are the ones that are piling up pressure, and one wrong move and you could lose material as the black pieces, or you can get attacked because this king is also not feeling very safe. So in a position like this, a good move for white would be something like rook to e4, a very flexible move trying to shift this rook either to c4 or a4 in the future, or even shift it over to the king side to go for a potential attack. And this is slightly advantageous for the white pieces. It's not winning right away, but because this king is slightly weak and also because we have tremendous pressure on this pawn on c5, this is going to be a really strong position for the white pieces. And in this case, white is using the threat on the king and the bad pawn structure simultaneously in order to win this game. And after queen takes c5 here, after queen takes c5, rook e8, rook e8, rook c5, this position is better for the white pieces. White is simply up a pawn. Let me go back to the beginning position and let me show you the structure that white had. This is the structure. Now let me change it a little bit. Instead of this pawn being on a7, now let me move this pawn over to d5. And now instead of having 3 pawn islands, black only has 2 pawn islands, same as white. However, these are the 2 connected passed pawns, and these are extremely dangerous. So whenever your opponents or you have 2 connected passed pawns where there are no pawns that can oppose these and they are connected as well, this is very, very dangerous. And in this case, white has to be very careful, because one wrong move and these pawns march down the board and all of a sudden you cannot stop them. So in this position, let's say you play a move like queen f6. It's what the computer recommends, but to me this is a difficult position to play already, so I'm not even sure what I would play here with the white pieces. Maybe here we're trying to threaten rook e7 in order to checkmate on g7. Of course, what black will do is black will try to stop that. However, this is still a very difficult position to play. We're getting into a situation where we have to blockade these pawns, and even though a computer might say that this is a draw, from a human point of view, this is maybe not so easy, because the 2 connected passers are very, very dangerous. Let me show you some other structures. Let me move on to this structure, for example. Earlier we talked about how split pawns are really bad, and the double split pawns or double isolated pawns are even worse, because the squares in front of these double isolated pawns are generally very weak. So in a position like this, this knight that is on d3 would go to f4, and then from f4 it pressures everything. It pressures the pawn on h5, it pressures the bishop on e6, and the problem is, even if you defend this pawn after king to g2, f3 is coming, and then there's not much you can do here. f3, the bishop has to go, let's say bishop to d7. We can even capture this pawn on h5, because after rook takes e3 we have a fork here, so you don't really have lots of good options. Let's say you go to f5, but once again we can capture this because we are winning 2 pawns here. We can go g4, we can go knight to f6. We have multiple options. So the double isolated pawns are very, very bad. You don't want to have these. The double pawns themselves are not so bad if they are in a clump. So if there are pawns next to them, like for example this h5 pawn, if it was on g6, then this would be fine for black. But because there are double isolated pawns, they're very weak, and this pawn structure is not good for the black pieces. So let me move on to yet another structure. This is a protected passed pawn in this situation, and protected passed pawns are also very dangerous, and this is good for the black pieces, and it's not good immediately. However, it is a long-term asset, which means that in an end game it is going to be invaluable. And even though it's not particularly great right now because it's blockaded and it's not doing anything, in the future it's always going to be good, and the threat of it is enough to make it valuable. So this pawn right here, even though it's not doing anything currently and it's not really valuable currently, in the future it is still going to become very, very dangerous. So you have to evaluate pawn structures from this perspective as well, not just what's going on right now, but also what can happen in the future. How can these liabilities turn into assets in the future? How can my opponent use these resources to beat me in an endgame down the road? These are all details that you have to take into consideration if you want to evaluate positions correctly and if you want to be a strong chess player. When evaluating closed positions, you always have to consider which side has more space. So in a position like this, white has more space, white is restricting the black pieces, and also white is restricting, if I could make normal arrows, white is restricting black's pawn breaks f5, and if black decides to ever go a6, we can always go a4 to restrict that as well. So for example, if we were to play a move like h4, let's say black plays a6 to try to go b5, we will stop that with a4. Now we are restricting both of black's pawn breaks, not allowing black's position to open up, and we also have more space, so we are completely dominating on every single side of the board, and this position is also advantageous for the white pieces. In positions like these, you have to look at, can my opponent develop his pieces normally? And in this case, black cannot, because we are restricting them so well. These pieces are just simply unable to find good squares. You can try to maneuver this to b6, but it's not going to be doing anything on b6. It's very, very useless there, and it is very hard to develop. And also we are restricting b5 and f5 once again, therefore the rooks will also always stay closed. Therefore this position is better for the white pieces because black simply cannot activate his position. The way we evaluate open positions is also different from the way we evaluate closed positions. For example, this position is very open. White is clearly better here. Why? It's because of superior piece activity and also superior king safety. This king on g1 is very safe, while this king on g8 is not so safe. It has these two bishops pointing at him. The knight can also jump to g5. The queen can also join the attack down the road, and this is a better position for the white pieces. Basically, the way we would evaluate this position is with the criteria that I was talking about throughout this whole video: king safety, piece activity, material, and so on. But when we take a look at this position, which is a more closed position, in this case, we know that because the position is closed, both kings are going to be safe. Both sides are going to have relatively equal amount of activity. Neither side is going to have more active pieces because it is a closed position, and neither side has pieces with large amounts of scope. All of the pieces are sort of either behind pawns or looking at pawns, so it's going to be slightly passive for the time being for both sides. However, we always have to look at pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are how we open up the position and how our pieces gain activity. So in this position, white is slightly better because white is faster with moves like a3 and b4, opening up this side of the board. White is faster with moves like f4. It's better to start with h3, but let's say h3, h6, and now we can play moves like f4, taking even more space. These are very uncomfortable because later down the road we can take more space with g4 and f5, and this is dangerous for our opponent. Let's say our opponent plays this move a6, we can even go f5 right away. Captures. Now this bishop has to move, and this is significantly better. Now we have opened up lines for our pieces. This bishop sees the pawn on h6. We have some squares here for our knights. The bishop has opened up. This knight can go to g3, queen can go to e1 and h4 down the road, and this is a very, very dangerous position for the black pieces. So when you evaluate closed positions, you always have to look at pawn breaks. These are necessary. In open positions, let me go back. In open positions, what matters most is getting the pieces out as quickly as possible and then trying to set up threats. So for example, in this position after queen e3, rook here, we would take this knight on f6, and there's not much our opponent can do. After g takes f6, queen h6, we have a devastating attack. f5, knight g5, we just continue attacking. Bishop takes g5, we don't even take back. We take the rook on e8 with checkmate. This is how you handle open positions, because in open positions what matters most is just simply getting the pieces out as quickly as possible, aiming them at the opponent's king, and then setting up some sort of an attack. But in closed positions, you always have to set up some form of pawn breaks in order to activate your pieces. So that is a slight difference between open positions and the way you evaluate open positions versus the way you evaluate closed positions.